Hey there, deep divers. So I've been on this whole mindfulness kick lately. And, I'm always looking for practical ways to actually bring more of that into my life.
Yeah, totally. It's one thing to read about mindfulness, but it's another thing to actually make it a habit.
Right. So I was doing some digging and stumbled across this really interesting blog post on LeStallion. It's called 50 Journal Prompts for Those Practicing Mindfulness. And let me tell you, it is jam-packed with thought-provoking
Oh,
prompts.
cool. I'm always up for a good journal prompt.
Me too. And I thought it would be fun to kind of use this blog post as a springboard for today's deep dive. We're going to unpack this whole intersection of mindfulness and journaling.
Sounds fascinating. I'm in.
Awesome. So I guess a good starting point would be to define what we even mean by mindfulness, right? Because it's one of those buzzwords that gets tossed around a lot these days.
It really is. It's everywhere you look. But at its essence, mindfulness is about tuning into the present moment. Like right here, right now, without judgment.
Okay, so it's about being present without overthinking or analyzing everything.
Yeah, exactly. It's about noticing your thoughts, your feelings, your bodily sensations, all of it, without getting swept away by them, like
Yeah.
not getting caught up in that endless loop of mental chatter.
So it's like hitting the pause button on that inner commentary and just being present with whatever's happening in this moment.
Exactly. It's a way of stepping back from your thoughts and observing them with a sense of curiosity rather than getting totally absorbed by them.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. And it sounds like journaling could be a really helpful tool for that, right?
Totally. Like this blog post we're talking about is full of journal prompts that are like these little invitations to practice mindfulness. They give you a structure, a starting point.
I love that. It's like having a mini mindfulness coach right there in your journal.
Right. And the prompts can be so simple, but so powerful. Like there's one that just asks, what is one thing you can hear right now?
That's so interesting because it seems so basic, but when was the last time you actually stopped to really listen to the sounds around you?
Totally. It's like we go through our days so often on autopilot, not really paying attention to what's going on around us. But when we take a moment to just tune into our senses, it brings us right back to the present.
It's like hitting the reset button on your awareness, right?
Exactly. And that's what mindfulness is all about. It's about waking up to the present moment. And the more you practice, the easier it becomes to access that state of awareness.
I love that. So it's like building a mindfulness muscle, right?
Absolutely. And just like any muscle, the more you use it, the stronger it gets.
Okay, I am all about building that mindfulness muscle. But, it's one thing to be aware of your surroundings, but what about our internal landscape? How does mindfulness play into our emotions?
That's such a key part of this, right? Because our emotions can be so powerful. They can really drive our thoughts and behaviors.
Yeah, and sometimes it feels like our emotions have a mind of their own, like they just take over and we're along for the ride.
Right. But mindfulness gives us the tools to step back from that emotional roller coaster and observe it with a bit more objectivity.
So it's not about suppressing our emotions or pretending they don't exist. It's about learning to observe them without judgment.
Exactly. And the blog post we're talking about has some really great prompts for exploring this. Like there's one that asks, how do you feel today and why do you think that is?
I love that because it encourages you to not just label your emotions, but to actually dig a little deeper and understand where they're coming from. Like, what's the root of that feeling?
And once you start to understand the why behind your emotions, it can be so empowering because it gives you more choice in how you respond.
That's huge because it's not always about changing the emotion itself, but about changing our relationship to it.
Right? Mindfulness helps us create a little bit of space between us and our emotions so we're not so overwhelmed by them.
And that space, that pause, can make all the difference in how we navigate those tricky emotional moments.
100%. And the blog post even has a prompt for that too. Describe an emotion you had trouble with recently. How did you handle it? It's
Yeah.
all about reflection, right? Like taking the time to look back and learn from our experiences.
And I love how it encourages you to look at those challenging emotions without judgment. Like, it's okay to have struggled. It's okay to have felt overwhelmed.
Totally. It's not about judging ourselves for having those emotions. It's about approaching them with curiosity and compassion.
I think that's such an important message. And it's something that I think we could all use a little more of in our lives.
For sure. We're all works in progress,
Yeah.
right?
Absolutely. And speaking of progress, I'm curious to dive into some of the more practical aspects of mindfulness. Like, how can we weave these practices into our everyday lives beyond just journaling?
That's a great question. Because it's one thing to be mindful while we're sitting quietly with our journals, but how do we bring that same awareness into the busyness of our daily routines?
So we're back and ready to dive into the practical side of mindfulness. It's all well and good to talk about being present, but how do we actually make that happen in our crazy busy lives?
Right. It's like I can totally get on board with the idea of mindfulness when I'm like on a yoga mat or something, but then real life comes knocking.
Exactly. So where do we even begin?
Well, the good news is it doesn't have to be this big, complicated thing. We don't have to like overhaul our entire life to make mindfulness a part of our routine.
Okay, that's reassuring. Because honestly, who has time for that?
Seriously. But like the blog we're talking about, it actually has some really cool prompts that relate to this. Like there's one that asks, how can you turn a daily chore into a mindful practice?
Oh, yeah, that one really jumped out at me because honestly, when I think of mindfulness, I definitely don't think of chores.
Right. It seems kind of counterintuitive, but that's the beauty of it. It's about finding those little pockets of mindfulness in the midst of our everyday routines.
Okay, so how do we actually do that? How do we turn something like, say, washing dishes into a mindful experience?
Okay, so picture this.
Yeah.
Instead of like rushing through the dishes so you can get back to whatever you were doing, you decide to make that dishwashing time your mindful moment.
Hmm.
And you start to pay attention to all the sensations involved. The feel of the warm water on your hands, the scent of the dish soap, even the sound of the water running.
It's like you're engaging all your senses in that moment instead of just going through the motions.
Exactly. And you know what else? The blog has another great prompt about this. It says, describe your last meal using all your senses.
Oh, that's a good one. Because, let's be real, how often do we actually pay attention to what we're eating? We're
Right.
usually like shoveling food in our mouths while scrolling through our phones.
It's so true. But imagine if we actually slowed down and savored our food, like really
Hmm.
tasted it, noticed the textures, the aromas. It could totally transform the experience of eating.
It's like turning your meal into a mini meditation.
Exactly. And it's not just eating and chores either. Think about all those other everyday activities that we usually do on autopilot, like walking.
Oh my gosh, yes. Walking is my go-to for zoning out.
Right. But what if, instead of letting our minds wander while we walk, we actually paid attention to the feeling of our feet hitting the ground, the rhythm of our breath, the sights and sounds around us?
It's like you're suddenly more present in your own life, instead of just going through the motions.
Exactly. And the more we can cultivate this awareness in those simple everyday moments, the more it starts to spill over into other areas of our lives too, like our relationships.
Ooh, okay, yeah. Let's talk about that. Because relationships can be tricky territory, even without adding mindfulness into the mix. Okay, so mindfulness in relationships. I'll be honest, this is the part where I'm like, how do I actually do that without making things weird?
I hear you. It's like you don't want to be that person who's like staring intensely at someone while they're trying to tell you about their day, right?
Exactly. So, how do we bring mindfulness into our relationships in a way that feels natural and authentic?
Well, I think a good starting point is to think about it as bringing that same quality of presence to our interactions that we've been cultivating in other areas of our lives.
Right.
Like, remember we were talking about how mindfulness is about really paying attention to the present moment.
Right. Like when we were talking about turning those everyday tasks like washing dishes or eating a meal into mindful moments.
Exactly. It's about bringing that same quality of attention to our interactions with the people we care about. So, like, instead of half listening while we're also checking our phones or planning out our next to-do list item,
Oh my gosh, I'm so guilty of that.
we all are. It's so easy to get caught up in our own heads. But when we make a conscious effort to really tune into the other person, to really listen to what they're saying, both verbally and non-verbally.
It's like we're giving them the gift of our full attention.
Exactly. And that's such a powerful thing because it says, I see you, I hear you, and what you have to say is important to me.
I love that. It's like we're shifting from simply hearing the words someone is saying to actually listening with our full being.
And you know what's cool? The blog post actually has some journal prompts that relate to this. Like, there's one that asks, how can being mindful change the way you talk to others?
Oh, that's a good one. Because it's not just about how we listen, it's also about how we speak, right?
Totally. When we're mindful, we're more likely to speak with kindness, compassion, and authenticity.
And less likely to say something we regret later because we weren't fully present in the conversation.
Exactly. And you know what else I love about this blog post? It
Hmm.
reminds us that mindfulness is a journey, not a destination. Like, we're not going to suddenly become perfectly mindful beings overnight.
Oh, thank goodness.
Right. But the more we can weave these little moments of mindfulness into our lives, whether it's through journaling, paying attention to our senses, or simply taking a few deep breaths before we engage in a conversation, the more we cultivate that muscle of presence. And that benefits not just us, but all of our relationships too.
I love that. So, as we wrap up our deep dive into mindfulness and journaling, is there one final piece of advice you'd like to leave our listeners with?
I think it all comes back to that idea of starting small. Don't put too much pressure on yourself to be perfectly mindful all the time. Just pick one thing, whether it's paying attention to your breath for a few moments, savoring your next meal, or really listening to a loved one, and make that your mindful moment.
That is such great advice. Small steps, big impact. This has been such a fascinating conversation, and I feel like I've learned so much. Thank you so much for sharing your insights with us.
It's been my pleasure.
And to all of our deep divers out there, we encourage you to keep exploring the power of mindfulness in your own lives. Until next time, keep diving deep.